How's it going? Welcome to another Tales of Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. If you're watching from YouTube, hi and welcome. My name is Stigma or Tony or whichever you prefer. I will be your reader today of this tale. If you're watching from YouTube, make sure you hit that like and subscribe down below. It helps out the algorithms quite a bit. Thank you so much for your support. So today we're going to be reading Acts 3 and 4 of The Shunned House. If you haven't already read or listened to the first two parts, you can go back into my channel. There's a playlist for the Tales of Horror, and you can find all the Tales of Horror which we've uploaded previously on there. I still haven't gotten around to adding this one in particular, but it shall be added later, probably tomorrow. Yeah, I'll probably be adding it tomorrow, so look forward to that. I fell a little bit behind on the Tale of Horror uploads, but I'm getting to it as fast as possible. The Shunned House, Act 3. It may well be imagined how powerful I was affected by the annals. In this continuous record, there seemed to me to brood a persistent evil beyond anything in nature, as I had known it, an evil clearly connected with the house and not with my family. This impression was confirmed by my uncle's less systematic array of miscellaneous data. Legends transcribed from servant gossip, cuttings from the papers, copies and death certificates by fellow physicians, and the like. All of this material I cannot hope to give, for my uncle was a tireless antiquarian, and very deeply interested in the Shunned House, but I may refer to several dominant points which earn notice by their recurrence through many reports from diverse sources. For example, the servant gossip was practically unanimous in attributing to the fungus and the malodorous cellar of the house a vast supremacy of evil influence. There had been servants, and white especially, who would not use the cellar kitchen, and at least 3 well-defined legends bore upon the queer quasi-human or diabolic outlines assumed by tree roots and patches of mold in that region. These later narratives interested me profoundly on account of what I had seen in my boyhood, but I felt that most of the significance had in each case been largely obscured by additions from the common stock of local ghost lore. Anne White, with her Exeter superstition, had promulgated most extravagant and at the same time most consistent tale, alleging that there must have lied buried beneath the house one of those vampires, the dead who must lie buried beneath the house, one of those vampires, the dead who retain their bodily form and live on the blood breath of the living, whose hideous legions send their preying shapes or spirits abroad by night. To destroy a vampire, one must, the grandmother say, exhume it and burn its heart, or at least drive a stake through that organ. And Anne's dogged insistence on a search under the cellar had been prominent in bringing about her discharge. Her tales, however, commanded a wide audience, and were the more readily accepted because the house indeed stood on land once used for burial purposes. To me, their interest depended less on the circumstance than on the peculiarly appropriate way in which they devotailed with certain other things. The complaint of the departing servant preserved Smith, who had preceded Anne, and never heard of her. That something sucked his breath at night. The death certificates of fever victims of 1804 issued by Dr. Chad Hopkins, enshrining the four deceased persons all unaccountably lacking in blood, and the obscure passages of poor Roby Harris ravings, where she complained of the sharp teeth of a glassy-eyed, half-visible presence. Free from unwanted superstition though I am, these things produced in me an odd sensation, which was intensified by a pair of widely separated newspaper cuttings relating to deaths in the Shun house. One from the Providence Gazette and County Journal of April 12th, 1815, and the other from the Daily Transcript of the Chronicle of October 28th, 1845, each of which detailed an appallingly grisly circumstance whose duplication was remarkable. It seemed that in both instances the dying person, in 1815 a gentle old lady named Stafford, and in 1845 a schoolteacher of middle age named Elzar Dufree, became transfigured in a horrible way, glaring glassily and attempting to bite the throat of the attending physician. Even more puzzling, though, was the final case which put an end to the renting of the house. A series of anemia deaths, preceded by progressive madness, wherein the patient would craftily attempt the lives of the relatives by incision in the neck or wrists. This was in 1860 and 1861 when my uncle had just begun his medical practice, and before leaving for the front, he heard much of it from his elder professional colleagues. The really inexplicable thing was the way in which the victims, ignorant people, for the ill smelling and wildly shunned house could now be rented to no others, would babble maledictions in French language language that they could not possibly have studied to an extent. It made one think of poor Roby Harris nearly a century before, and so moved my uncle that he commenced collecting historical data on the house after listening some time subsequent to his return from the war to the first-hand account of Dr. Chase and Whitmarsh. Indeed, I could see that my uncle had thought deeply on the subject, and that he was glad of my own interest, an open-minded and sympathetic interest which enabled him to discuss with me matters at which others would merely have laughed. His fancy had not gone so far as mine, but he felt that the place was rare in its imaginative potentialities, and worthy of note as an inspiration in the field of grotesque and macabre. For my part, I was disposed to take the whole subject with profound seriousness, and began at once not only to review the evidence, but to accumulate as much more as I could. I talked with the elderly Archer Harris, then owner of the house, many times before his death in 1916, and obtained from him and his still surviving maiden sister Alice an authentic corroboration of all the family data my uncle had collected. When, however, I asked them what connection with France or its language the house could have, they confessed themselves as frankly baffled and ignorant as I. Archer knew nothing, and all that Miss Harris could say was that an old allusion her grandfather, Duty Harris, had heard of might have shed a little light. The old seaman who had survived his son Welcome's death in battle by 2 years had not himself known the legend, but recalled that his early nurse, the ancient Maria Robbins, seemed darkly aware of something that might have lent a weird significance to the French ravings of Roby Harris, which she had so often heard during the last days of that hapless woman. Maria had been at the Shunned house from 1769 till the removal of her family in 1783, and had seen Mercy Dexter die, Once she hinted to the child duty of a somewhat peculiar circumstance in Mercy's last moments, but he had soon forgotten all about it save that it was something peculiar. The granddaughter, moreover, recalled even this much was difficult. She and her brother were not so much interested in the house as was Archer's son, Carrington, the present owner with whom I talked after my experience. Having exhausted the Harris family of all the information it could furnish, I turned my attention to early town records and deeds with a zeal more penetrating than that which my uncle had occasionally shown in the same work. What I wished was a comprehensive history of the site from its very settlement in 1636, or even before, if any Narragansett Indian legend could be unearthed to supply the data. I found at the start that the land had been part of a long strip of home lot granted originally to John Throckmorton, one of the many similar strips beginning at the town street beside the river and extending up over the hill to a line roughly corresponding with the modern Hope Street. The Throckmorton had later, of course, been much subdivided, and I became very assiduous in tracing this section through which Back or Benefit Street was later run. It had, a rumor indeed said, been the Throckmorton grave, but as I examined the record more carefully, I found that the graves had all been transferred at an early date to the North Burial Ground at the Pawtucket West Road. Then I suddenly, then suddenly I came, by a rare piece of chance, since it was not in the main body of records, and might easily have been missed, upon something which aroused my keenest eagerness, fitting in as it did with several of the queerest phases of the affair. It was the record of a lease in 1697 of a small tract of ground to the Atin roulette of wife, to an atelier roulette and wife. At last the French element had appeared, that and another deeper element of horror which the name conjured up from the darkest recesses of my weird and heterogeneous readings, and I feverishly studied the platting of the locality as it had been before the cutting through the partial straightening of Back Street between 1747 and 1758. I found that I had half expected that where the shunned house now stood, the Roulettes had laid out their graveyard beyond a one-story and attic cottage, and that no record of any transfer of graves existed. The document indeed ended in much confusion, and I was forced to ransack both the Rhode Island Historical Society and Shepley Library before I could find a local door which the name Italian Roulette would unlock. In the end, I did find something. Something of such vague and monstrous import that I set about at once to examine the cellar of the shunned house itself with a new and excited minuteness. The Roulettes, it seemed, had come in 1696 from East Greenwich, down the west shore of Narragansett Bay. They were Huguenots from Claude, and had encountered much opposition before the Providence settlement allowed them to settle in the town. Unpopularity had dogged them in East Greenwich, whither they had come in 1686, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and rumor said that the cause of dislike extended beyond mere racial and national prejudice, or the land disputes which involved other French settlers with the English and rivalries which not even Governor Andros could quell. But their ardent Protestantism, too ardent, some whispered, and their evident distress when virtually driven from the village down the bay had moved the sympathy of the town farther. Here, the strangers had been granted a haven, and a swarthy Edeline roulette less a pot at agriculture than at reading queer books and drawing queer diagrams and giving a clerical post at the warehouse at Pardon Trigglehof's wharf. Tillinghoff's wharf, far south of Town Street. There had, however, been a riot of some sort later on, perhaps 40 years later after old Rouillette's death. And no one seemed to hear of the family after that. For a century or more, and more, it appeared that the Rouillettes had been well remembered and frequently discussed as vivid incidents in the quiet life of the New England seaport. Adeline's son Paul, a surly fellow whose erratic condition had probably provoked the riot which wiped out the family, was peculiarly a source of the speculation. And though Providence never shared the witchcraft panic of her Puritan neighbors, it was freely intimidated by old wives intimated by old wives, and his prayers were neither uttered at the proper time nor directed towards the proper object. All this had undoubtedly formed the basis of the legend known as Old Maria Robbins. With what relation it had to the French ravings of Roby Harris and other inhabitants of the shunned house, imagination or future discovery alone could determine. I wondered how many of these who had known the legends realized that additional link with the terrible which my wider reading had given me, that ominous item in the annals of morbid horror which tells of the creature Jacques Roulette of Corday, who in 1598 was condemned to death as a demonic, but afterwards saved from the stake by the Paris Parliament and shut in a madhouse. He had been found covered with blood and shreds of flesh in the wood. Shortly after the killing and rending of a boy by a pair of wolves, one wolf had seen a lope away unhurt. Surely a pretty hearthside tale, with a queer significance as to name and place, but I decided that the Providence gossips could not have generally known of it. Had they known, the coincidence of names would have brought some drastic and frightened action. Indeed, might not its limited whisperings have precipitated the final riot which erased the Roulettes from the town? I now visited the accursed place with increased frequency, studying the building and poring over every inch of the earthen cellar floor. Finally, with the Carrington Harris permission, I fitted a key to the disused door opening from the cellar directly upon Benefit Street, preferring to have a more immediate access to the outside world than the dark stairs, ground floor, hall, and front door could give. There were morbidly lurked most thickly. I searched and poked during long afternoons when the sunlight filtered in through the cobwebs above ground windows, and a sense of security glowed from the unlocked door, which placed me only a few feet from the placid sidewalk outside. Nothing new rewarded my efforts. Only the same depressing mustiness and faint suggestion of noxious odors and nitrous outlines on the floor, and I fancy that many pedestrians must have watched me curiously through the broken panes. At length, upon a suggestion of my uncle's, I decided to try the spot nocturnally. And one stormy midnight ran the beams of an electric torch over the moldy floor with its uncanny shapes and distorted half phosphorescent fungi. The place had dispirited me curiously at evening, and I was almost prepared when I saw, or thought I saw, amidst the whitish deposit, a particularly sharp definition of the huddled form I had suspected from boyhood. Its clearness was astonishing and unprecedented, and as I watched, I seemed to see again the thin yellowish shimmering exhalations which had startled me on that rainy afternoon so many years before. Above the anthropomorphic patch of mold by the fireplace, it rose, a subtle, sickish, almost luminous vapor, which, as it hung trembling in its dampness, seemed to develop a vague and shocking suggestion of form. Gradually, trailing off its nebulous decay and passing up into the blackness of the great chimney with the photor in its wake. It was truly horrible, and the more so to me because of what I knew of the spot. Refusing to flee, I watched it fade, and as I watched, it felt that it was in turn watching me greedily with eyes more imaginable than vision. Then I told my uncle about it. He was greatly aroused, and after a tense hour of reflection, arrived at a definite and drastic decision, weighing in his mind the importance of the matter and the significance of our relation to it. He insisted that we both test, and if possible, destroy the horror of the house by a joint night or nights of aggressive vigil in that musty and fungus cursed cellar. And that concludes Act 3. Wow, I almost want to end it off on that act. Because that's such a good, like, that was such a good kind of act to end it on. I could probably do 2 acts tomorrow, too. But let's continue, shall we? Maybe, how many pages is this? Oh, wow, this is actually a long, long section. 12, 13. Yeah, we'll do one more act. I don't want to leave you guys on a cliffhanger, do I? Act 4. On Wednesday, June 25th, 1919, after a proper notification of Carrington Harris, which did not include surmises as to what we expected to find, my uncle and I conveyed to the shunned house two camp chairs, and a folding camp cot, together with some scientific mechanism of great weight and intricacy. These were placed in the cellar during the day, screening the windows with paper and planning to return in the evening for our first vigil. We had locked the door from the cellar to the ground floor, and having a key to the outside cellar door, we were prepared to leave our expensive and delicate apparatus, which we had obtained secretly and at great cost, as many days as our vigils might need to be protracted. It was our design to sit up together till very late and then watch singly till dawn at 2 hour stretches, myself first and then my companion, the inactive member resting on the cot. The natural leadership with which my uncle procured the instruments from the laboratories of Brown University and the Cranston Street Armory, and the instinctively assumed direction of our venture, was a marvelous commentary on the potential vitality and resilience of a man of 81. Elihu Whipple had lived according to the hygienic laws he had preached as a physician, and but for what happened later would be here in full vigor today. Only 2 persons suspect what did happen: Carrington Harris himself and myself. I had to tell Harris because he owned the house and deserved to know what had gone out of it. Then, too, we had spoken to him in advance of our quest, and I felt, after my uncle's going, that he would understand and assist me in some vitally necessary public explanations. He turned very pale, but agreed to help me and decided that it would now be safe to rent the house. To declare that we were not nervous on that rainy night of watching would be an exaggeration, both gross and ridiculous. We were not, as I have said, in any sense childishly superstitious, but scientific study and reflection have taught us that the known universe of 3 dimensions embraces the merest fraction of the whole cosmos of substance and energy. In that case, an overwhelming preponderance of evidence from numerous authentic sources pointed to a tenacious existence of certain forces with great power and, so far as the human point of view is concerned, exceptional malignancy. To say that we actually believed in vampires or werewolves would be a carelessly inclusive statement. Rather, must it be said that we were not prepared to deny the possibility of certain unfamiliar and unclassified modifications of vital force and attenuated matter, existing very infrequently in 3 dimensional space because of its more intimate connection with other spatial units, yet close enough to the boundary of our own to furnish us occasional manifestations, which we, for lack of a proper vantage point, may never hope to understand. In short, it seemed to my uncle and me that my incontrovertible array of facts pointed to some lingering influence in the shunned house, traceable to one or another of the ill-favored French settlers of 2 centuries before, and still operative through rare and unknown laws of atomic and electronic motion. And the father of the roulette had possessed an abnormal affinity for outer circles of entity, dark spheres which, for normal folk, hold only repulsion and terror. Their recorded history seemed to prove. Had not then the riots of those bygone 17th centuries set moving certain kinetic patterns in the morbid brain of one or more of them, notably the sinister Paul Rouliet, which obscurely survived the bodies murdered and buried by the mob, and continued to function in some multiple dimensional space along the original lines of force determined by a frantic hatred of the encroaching community. Such a thing was surely not a physical or biochemical improbability in the light of a newer science which includes the theory of relativity and intraatomic action. One might easily imagine an alien nucleus of substance or energy, formless or otherwise, kept alive by imperceptible or immaterial subtractions from the life force or bodily tissues and fluids of others and more palpably living things into which it penetrates, and with those fabrics it sometimes completely merges itself. It might be actively hostile, or it might be indicated merely by blind motives or self preservation. In any case, such a monster must, of necessity, be in our scheme of things an anomaly and an intruder, which interpretation forms a primary duty with every man not an enemy to the world's life, health, and sanity. What baffled us was our utter ignorance of the aspect in which we might encounter the thing. No sane person had even seen it, and few had ever felt it definitely. It might be pure energy, a form ethereal and outside the realm of substance. or it might be partly material, some unknown or equivocal mass of plasticity capable of changing at will to nebulous approximations of the solid, liquid, gaseous, or tenuously unparticled states. The anthropomorphic patch of mold on the floor, the form of the yellowish vapors, and curative, the curvature of the tree roots in some of the old tales all argued at least a remote and reminiscent connection with the human shape, but how representative or permanent that similarity might be, none could say with any kind of certainty. We had devised two weapons of fight to fight it: a large and specially fitted Crookes tube operated by powerful storage batteries and provided with peculiar screenings and reflectors in case it proved intangible or opposable only by vigorously destructive ether radiations, and a pair of military flamethrowers of the sort used in the World War in case it proved partially material and susceptible to mechanical destruction. For, like the superstitious exter-rustics, we were prepared to burn the thing's heart out of its heart. We were prepared to burn the thing's heart out if heart existed to burn. All this reference to the cot and chairs. Oh, all this aggressive mechanism we set in the cellar in positions carefully arranged with the reference to the cot and chairs. And to the spot before the fireplace where the mold had taken strange shapes, that suggestive patch, by the way, was only faintly visible when we placed our furniture and instruments, and when we returned that evening for the actual vigil. For a moment, I half doubted that I had ever seen it in a more definitely limed form. But then I thought of the legend. Our cellar vigil began at 10 p.m., daylight savings time, and as I continued, we found no promise of pertinent developments. A weak, filtered glow from the rain harassed street lamps outside, and a feeble phosphorescent form of the detestable fungi within, shrewd and dripping stone of the walls from which all traces of whitewash had vanished, the dank, fetid, and mildewed tainted hard earth floor with its obscene fungi, the rotting remains of what had been stools, chairs, and tables, and other more shapeless furniture, and heavy planks with the massive beams on the ground floor overhead, the decrepit plank doors leading to bins and chambers beneath other parts of the house, the crumbling stone staircase with ruined wood handrail, and the crude and cavernous fireplace of blackened bricks where rusted iron fragments revealed the past presence of hooks, andirons, spit, crane, and a door to the Dutch oven. Ooh, Dutch oven. Kinky. These things and our austere cot and damp chairs and the heavy and intricate destructive machinery we had brought. We had, as in my own former explorations, left the door to the street unlocked, so that a direct and practical path of escape might lie open in case of manifestations beyond our power to deal with. It was our idea that our continued nocturnal presence would call forth whatever malign, mel, malign, melian, malignant. It's not malignant. I guess it's a past tense. Malign. That's the first time I've ever really heard it that way. Call forth whatever malign entity lurked there, and that, being prepared, we could dispose of the thing with one or the other of our provided means as soon as we had recognized and observed it sufficiently. How long it might require to invoke and extinguish the thing, we had no notion. It occurred to us, too, that our venture was far from safe, for in what strength the thing might appear, no one could tell, but we deemed the game worth the hazard and embarked on it alone, and unhesitantly conscious that the seeking of the outside aid would only expose us to the ridicule and perhaps defeat of our entire purpose. Such was our frame of mind as we talked far into the night, till my uncle's growing drowsiness made me remind him to lie down for his 2 hours' sleep. Something like fear chilled me as I sat there in a small hours alone. I say alone, for one who sits by a sleeper is indeed alone, perhaps more alone than he can realize. My uncle breathed heavily. In his deep inhalations and exhalations, accompanied by the rain outside and punctuated by other nerve wracking sounds of distant, dripping water within, for the house was repulsively damp even in dry weather. And in this storm, positively swamp like, I studied the loose antique masonry of the walls in the fungus light and the feeble rays which stool in from the streets from the screened window, and once when the noisome atmosphere of the place seemed about to sicken me, I opened the door and looked up and down the street, feasting my eyes on familiar sights and my nostrils on wholesome air. Still, nothing occurred to reward my watching, and I yawned repeatedly. Fatigue getting the better of my apprehension. Then the stirring of my uncle in his sleep attracted my notice. He had turned restlessly on the cot several times during the later half of the first hour, but now he was breathing in unusual irregularity, occasionally heaving a sigh, which held more than a few of the qualities of a choking moan. I turned my electric flashlight on him and found his face averted. So, rising and crossing to the other side of the cot, I again flashed the light to see if it seemed in any pain. What I saw unnerved me most surprisingly, considering its relative triviality. It must have been merely the association of any odd circumstance with the sinister nature of our location and mission, for surely the circumstance was not in itself frightful or unnatural. It was merely that my uncle's facial expression, disturbed no doubt by the strange dreams which our situation prompted, betrayed considerable agitation, and seemed not at all characteristic of him. His habitual expression was one of kindly and well-bred calm, whereas now a variety of emotions seemed struggling within him. I think, on the whole, that it was a variety which chiefly disturbed me. My uncle, as he grasped and tossed in increasing perturbation, with his eyes that had now started open, seemed not one but many men, and suggested a curious quality of alienage from himself. All at once he commenced to mutter, and I did not like the look of his mouth and teeth as he spoke. The words were at first indistinguishable, and then, with a tremendous start, I recognized something about them which filled me with icy fear till I recalled the breadth of my uncle's education and the interminable translations he had made from the anthropological and antiquarian articles in the Rêve des Deux Mondes. For the venerable Elihu Whipple was muttering in French, and the few phrases I could distinguish seemed connected with the darkest myths he had ever adapted from the famous Paris magazine. Suddenly, A perspiration broke out on the sleeper's forehead, and he leaped abruptly up, half awake. The jumble of French changed to a cry in English, and the hoarse voice shouted excitedly, "My breath! My breath!" Then the awakening became complete, and with a subsidence of facial expressions to my normal state, my uncle seized my hand and began to relate a dream whose nucleus of significance I could only surmise with a kind of awe. He had, he said, floated off from a very ordinary series of dream pictures into a scene whose strangeness was related to nothing he had ever read. It was of this world, and yet not of it, a shadowy geometrical confusion in which he could be seen elements of familiar things in most unfamiliar and perturbing combinations. There was a suggestion of queerly disordered pictures superimposed one upon another, an arrangement in which the essentials of time as well as of space seemed dissolved and mixed in the most illogical fashion. In his kaleidoscopic vortex of phantasmal images were occasional snapshots, if one might use a term, of singular clearness but unaccountable heterogeneity. Once my uncle thought he lay in a carelessly dug open pit with a crowd of angry faces framed by straggling locks and three-cornered hats frowning on him. Again, he seemed to be in the interior of a house, an old house apparently. But the details and inhabitants were constantly changing, and he could never be certain of the faces or the furniture, or even of the room itself, since doors and windows seemed in just as great a state of flux as the more presumably mobile objects. It was queer, damnably queer, and my uncle spoke almost sheepishly, as if half expecting not to be believed, when he declared that of the strange faces, many of the unmistakable born and features of the Harris family. And all the while there was a personal sensation of choking, as if some pervasive presence had spread itself through his body and sought to possess itself of his vital processes. I shuddered at the thought of those functioning. I shudder at the thought of those vital processes, worn as they were by 81 years of continuous functioning, in conflict with unknown forces of which the youngest and strongest system might well be afraid, but in another moment reflected that dreams are only dreams, and that these uncomfortable visions could be, at most, no more than my uncle's reaction to the investigations and expectations which had lately filled our minds to the exclusion of all else. Conversation also soon tended to dispel my sense of strangeness, and in time I yielded to my yawns and took my turn at slumber. My uncle seemed now very wakeful and welcomed his period of watching, even though the nightmare had aroused him far ahead of his allotted 2 hours. Sleep seized me quickly, and I was at once haunted with dreams of most disturbing kind. I felt in my visions a cosmic and abysmal loneliness and hostility surging from all sides upon some prison where I lay confined. I seemed bound and gagged and tainted by the echoing yells of distant multitudes who thirsted for my blood. My uncle's face came to me with less pleasant associations than in waking hours, and I recall many futile struggles and attempts to scream. It was not my pleasant sleep, and for a second I was not sorry for the echoing shriek which clove through the barriers of the dream and flung me to a sharp and startled awakeness, in which every actual object before my eyes stood out with more than natural clearness and reality. And that concludes Act 4 of today's story. make sure to come back tomorrow if you like to see this live. I usually do these on Twitch, twitch.tv/stigmaxoxo. Go check that out. Make sure you're following. Make sure you hit the notification button. It'll let you know when I'm going live. You can also check out my Twitter, X. I do have a Blue Sky. It's kind of old and I never post on there, but go check that out too. I'm probably going to start posting on there because it seems like there's a lot of people kind of making the slow migration into Blue Sky. Um, the only problem is I might have to change the name because I think I have it under character stigma or CH stigma, and I have to change it to stigma XOXO. So hopefully they're able to do that, but I think it's going to be like a long process for that. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. Shit, I might just end up going with my regular name. Who knows? Um, but okay, yes, that concludes the recording. On YouTube, there should be some boxes that are going to be popping up right along over here. There's going to be the playlist for the other story times, the Grimm's Fairy Tales and the Tales of Horror. Go check those out. Really good stories in there. And make sure you like the stories that you loved. It helps me kind of get a good visual as to like what stories are really hitting in terms of for audiences and stuff like that. And at the end, once I finish all these books, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna look up the most liked videos by far, and try and see what I can do with some of them. Maybe I might try to animate them later on 2D, or I might try to do something like maybe more professionally done. But we'll see. I don't know. I might pick like the top 10 of those of the that playlist and redo them in some kind of like play form or professional manner. We'll see though. We'll definitely see. Thank you so much. I will catch you for the next one. Bye. Bye 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 bye.